Welcome everyone. It's great to see you. Um, Tonight, let us begin with a soft landing and mindful self-compassion meditation. So take a moment and gently close your eyes or gaze downwards. And let us come in and settle in for a soft landing. Like a pilot of a plane coming down in the runway. And let us gently land in our bodies in the present moment. Take a deep and full breath as the body breathes, and you notice the air moving up and through the nostrils and through into your heart and lungs as you breathe out and let go. Fully inhabit your body as a single live energy field. And notice and feel your feet on the floor, supported below by the earth, symbolizing your connection with nature. And now notice your support in the chair you're sitting on, grounded and steady. I invite you to bring your awareness to the center region around your chest, the heart. And notice what the heart feels like now. Perhaps it is a little closed with some pain and discomfort, and you allow that to be just as it is. Or your heart may be open and receptive with feelings of connection, contentment, and love. Being present and awake for whatever may arise in this moment. If you like, bring both hands onto your heart and now feel the warmth of your own embrace. And now as you step off the plane and walk out into everyday life, I invite you to recall a situation where you experienced some minor conflict. Let's say on a scale of 10, maybe about a 3. And that conflict could be perhaps in a relationship, it may be at work or in some other setting. Take a moment and notice how you feel now as this situation is recalled from your memory. Perhaps there is some low-level anger, sadness, confusion, or maybe an irritation or some resistance. Now I invite you to shift oh so slightly in your chair with your eyes still closed or gaze downwards and name whatever it is you are feeling. Or just notice the vibration of energy of the emotion as you turn your gaze towards it, allowing it to be as it is. Like the tree that turns and faces a bolt of lightning as it strikes, and acknowledge by whispering within, this is difficult right now. And as you face this disturbance, you may want to move one or both of your hands to the center region of your heart or to some other soothing place. And I invite you to ask yourself this question: what do I need now? Let this question drop into your body as you let it sink in. And then Let go of that thought as it sinks in deeply. And then again, ask yourself, what do I really, really need? And allow this question to sink in as if your well being depended on it. Some wishes or soothing phrases may come up for you, or you may want to ask yourself this question: what would I say to a dear friend who was experiencing the same condition as I am right now? And let that gentle whisper arise as if it is coming from inside you. That whisper may be something like to feel some connection, to embody freedom, to be the love, or to be heard. Or it may be to physically get up and do something like a walk in nature, an exercise, a cup of tea, or maybe perhaps calling a good friend. As you give yourself this gift, observe that it may look a little bit like a flower budding as the sun beats down on your wish. Now, from this space, this very open, expansive space of awareness, I invite you to open your eyes gently and look around and gaze at the people in front of you as if it was the first time you ever set your eyes on them. And sense a recognition that the pain that you're experiencing is part of our human condition. And that what I am experiencing personally is just my flavor of it. And from this place, feel the connection with others rather than a sense of isolation or self-pity, so that your pain is transformed into a moment of connection with someone else. Like that bolt of lightning that struck the tree earlier, now all the leaves turn together in unison and face the same lightning. And as we come to a close of this meditation, offer gratitude for the soft landing and the self-compassion gift that you gave yourself. So now what we're going to do is we're going to shift to a PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to shortly bring up. And see, I'm going to move this over a little bit. Okay, does everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very talented.
All righty. So thank you, Ann. So what I'm going to suggest we do is about 25 slides to go through, and so what I would like to do is save time at the end, where each of us will have, depending on how many people join us, but roughly about 5 minutes we'll take turns uh, to basically speak what's alive for us right now, and specifically regarding self-compassion, perhaps in your own life, or self-compassion in coaching. And then after one person goes for about 5 minutes, we'll take about 30 seconds of silence, and then we'll have about a minute or two of feedback to the person where anybody else could jump in, really as sort of like a coach, right? As a coach, if they heard a client speak about that, and just add some value and some acknowledgement of what was heard. And then we'll kind of take turns. So um, let us begin. So the outline of the presentation, we're going to start out really, what is self-compassion? What self-compassion is not? We're going to get into the physiology of self-compassion, the yin and yang of self-compassion. We'll talk about presence and mindfulness. We'll also get into self-compassion and goals, specifically as it relates to our clients. We'll also get into letting go of resistance, and then finally, compassion and the coaching process. So what is self-compassion? Well, informally, on an informal basis, self-compassion is treating yourself as you would a good friend who is experiencing same or very similar conditions as you are. That's the informal definition. Now, what typically happens is that a situation will arise in one's life, and there'll be some kind of reaction. And this reaction is really a conditioned response to a so-called negative event that might happen that'll trigger some kind of emotion or some other kind of feedback. Now, it's important to realize that self-compassion is not really to eliminate suffering. Rather, it is because of it that we can be fully compassionate. So I invite you right now, I'd like to just give it for all of us to experience what self-compassion feels like in the body. So I invite everybody to kind of make a fist like this, right? And just hold that fist. And now, just let it out. Now, when you do that, what emotions come up for you? Some people feel like a giving and receiving.
Feels like opening.
An opening.
Yeah, an opening of letting go.
Letting go, okay. Also an acceptance, perhaps, right? So that's the gesture of mindfulness or presence, which is one of the components. The next thing, I'd like you to just put your hands, both hands across on your chest, and really feel in the body what that feels like. What emotion comes up for you as you place your hands on your chest? Some people say it's a tenderness, a warmth.
Yeah, comfort.
Comfort. Okay. Comfort. Maybe a gentleness. And now I invite you to make a circle right in front of you, a little bit below your, right in front of you, with a little bit of an opening in the front. And just like a round circle, right? And that opening in the front is to allow other people to come in, and you're inviting other people into your circle. And really feel what that circle right in front of you feels like in the body. Some people feel a connection. Others perhaps might feel an inclusion. Others could feel diversity. Really feel that in the body. Okay. So, so what we did there is really the three components really of self-compassion. Much research has been done on this, and at the end of my presentation, I'll give you some references which you can look into on your own. But the research has shown that these three components really comprise a healthy self-compassion. The first is mindfulness, which is the ability to recognize and acknowledge what you are experiencing in the moment without resistance. Not by trying to run away from it, but through acceptance. Just like a few minutes ago when we did our meditation, when you recalled your memory, you faced what was right in front of you. So that was mindfulness. The next component is self-kindness. Now, self-kindness is really, what we're talking about here is an inclination of the heart. It's a authentic wish. And it's something that, you know, you really don't want to have any arguments in your mind. And this is something that is really personal to each unique individual. And sometimes having phrases is a big help. 3 or 4 phrases that really resonate with you, that you have available, such as "let me feel peace" is one. And generally speaking, this is done with a very soothing, compassionate voice. Now, self-compassion has a motivational aspect to it. Now, I mentioned before that it's not to eliminate suffering, right? But because of the suffering or pain that we're experiencing. And by the way, I'm using suffering in a very general sense here. It could be anything from, like, you know, you run into you bump into something and you have some kind of reaction to it. So suffering I'm using in a very general sense. But if you think of it in some other way, you know, that's okay as well. It could be some really significant thing that happens. So yes, self-compassion has a motivational component. And what that really comes down to is, what do I need now? So if you think about the pathway that we learned about exploring needs and values, that's really a form of self-compassion when you really get down to it. Now, the third aspect is common humanity, and that's when we did that big circle. Now, common humanity is, again, remembering that the pain you're experiencing is really a shared human experience, and that the pain that you're experiencing can be transformed into a moment of connection with others. Now, I'll give you an experience that I had this summer. You know, my mom was going through surgery, and I was in the waiting room, the patient waiting room, and the surgery was supposed to take about 2 hours, you know, and it was about a little bit past the 3rd hour. And, you know, I was practicing mindfulness and self-kindness, right? And I got this real feeling sense of a sense of isolation came over me, like I was alone. And then, all of a sudden, I looked around in the room and and I looked at the people there. There was about 15 people in the room. And I said to myself, you know, are you really believe that none of the other people in this room are going through the same thing you're going through? I mean, do you really believe that? And I looked at everybody in the room and I felt this connection that really made me shift. There was a shift happen. And a real synchronistic event happened about maybe a half hour later. Is about three people came over to me out of the blue and started talking to me. And they were asking me questions, and then we spent the next hour. And finally, I got notice. My mom, after about 4 hours, it was 2 hours longer than predicted. She came out and she was fine. But the connection that I made there, if it wasn't for the common humanity part, it would have been a very different outcome. So again, the three components, and sometimes if you want to bring them together, it's also called loving connected presence. Now, let me just stop. Does anybody want to add to that?
I don't think so.
Okay, great. All right, so the next part I'd like to go into is the different stages of self-compassion. Now, what will come up is, people have expressed doubts about their ability to be self-compassionate, right? Well, actually, that's a good sign because you're making progress. There are three stages in self-compassion. The first is a striving stage. Now, everybody begins at this stage because we want to feel better. And sometimes when practicing self-compassion, we really do feel better. And it feels a little bit like falling in love, sort of like the infatuation phase. And it's a question of how long that'll last, right? Until something comes up, something will happen, some kind of disillusionment will come up. And then you'll ask yourself, I'm the same person I always was. And this hasn't really changed me, this self-compassion practice. And a couple of things when this happens, because it will happen, that I want to point out. First of all techniques by themselves are destined to fail. And it's got to fail you. All techniques have got to fail. They're put in place for that purpose. And why do I say that? Because the intention originally, remember we started out with striving. The intention originally with the striving was to use self-compassion sort of like a little bit of a manipulation of your moment-to-moment experience in service of resistance. Now, let me give you an example of how I experienced that. I was going through some periods of not sleeping well. So I was practicing self-compassion, right? A couple of nights, slept pretty good. All of a sudden, third night, didn't sleep very well. So here I am saying the same thing. This self-compassion hasn't changed anything. I'm giving you an example of sleeping, but there are so many other examples how this can come up. So I want to point out that when you reach this stage of disillusionment, it's an opportunity to let go of the striving. Because you really can't learn self-compassion, but you can learn to embrace your own imperfections. And that's when we get into radical acceptance. Radical acceptance is a refinement of intention. It's sort of like a little bit like a melting and not a mining. It's befriending who you already are, the wholeness that you are, and aligning yourself with that. If there's a word that you can describe what it's like, it would be to become a compassionate disorder. Fully human, embracing the unknown, and holding on to it all. Now, let me just pause again if there's any questions or any kind of comments anybody wants to make. Okay. So the next slide is, what does self-compassion look like? Well, you can see that there's an interconnection of the three components. There's the now, mindfulness, presence. There's the heart, and then there's the connection or common humanity. So there are three correlative components of the same dynamic intelligence. Now, you can enter the self-compassion state from any one of those three components. Now, there are times when you may want to enter through common humanity, and you feel you're entering through making a connection with someone or a group of people, and that's the way you enter. Or you can enter through loving kindness, heart, some of the things we spoke about already, right? But really, you always, and it seems that way, it seems you're entering through loving kindness, it seems like you're entering through common humanity. But really what's happening is you're always entering through presence and mindfulness. That is the foundation for self-compassion and living in alignment.
It's interesting, George, that one thought that just came to me is, totally agree with you on the mindfulness piece, but your example of sitting in a hospital room and people coming up to you and connecting with you actually brings you, and this happens, others coming into your life brings you into mindfulness, which is kind of like interesting that the inversion of that, where others can actually draw you into mindfulness, which is a beautiful thing when it happens.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but that just...
Anybody else? And that's beautiful, Bruce. Thank you. Okay. So now talk about what self-compassion is not. Well, it's not a pity party. It's not a poor me. As I mentioned, you want to bring in our common humanity. It's not for wimps. I have to be strong kind of mentality. It's certainly not selfish. I need to focus on other people, not myself, kind of thought process. It's not lazy. The thought process, like something like, if I am compassionate to myself, nothing will get done. Well, that's not it. It's not making excuses. The old adage, I need to be hard on myself or I will fail. It's also not a goal to be achieved. Making self-compassion just another item for the future is not really what it's all about. Rather, self-compassion is a blueprint for manifestation now. It's also not accepted by society or culture in general. I will not be successful kind of thought process. focus on others and not myself mindset thinking, it actually hardens a sense of separation between myself and others. And that's what self-compassion is not.
Are you saying that self-compassion is not seen as acceptable by others? Is that what what not accepted is?
Well, it's a good question, Anne. I think about it. We're taught in generally by culture to be caring and compassion to others.
Mm-hmm.
But we're really, really not taught to be compassion to ourselves. So when I talk in a very general, broad sense, that most people are not taught that way. We're taught to be hard on ourselves. We're taught that if we're kind, we show loving kindness to ourselves, we'll never get anything done. Perhaps, as I mentioned, people think it's wimpy, lazy, or you're just in for a pity party for yourself. And that's not what it is when you look at it from the three components.
So I'm struggling with four wimps. I liked what you said better, George, when you said it's not wimpy. Is that what you said?
Right. It's not for wimpy. In other words, the idea is, the mentality is, I have to be strong. I have to be strong. Like when an emotion or some kind of problem comes up.
And that is not self-compassion.
Right. That is not self-compassion.
So yeah, it's just a tricky kind of thing to wrap when you said it's not for wimps. It's
right. Yeah. Right. Is that okay, Bruce? Is it okay with that?
Yeah, the wording has kind of tripped me up, I guess, a little.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I understand.
Kind of like a double negative, I think.
Right. It tripped me up too. Right. Yeah. Okay. So is everybody clear on that?
No.
Okay. Good. All right. So now I just want to get into the physiology of self-compassion. Now, self-compassion, believe it or not, has an evolutionary aspect to it. The reptilian brain in ancient times, with the fight, flight, or freeze motion, it came into being as sort of as a way to run away from danger, right? And it was very useful back then, and it's still useful today. However, what typically today, what gets triggered is the threat. Instead of being a physical threat, it's a threat to our own self-image. And so that's when that comes up. And of course, when that happens, the shadow elements come in. So further along the evolutionary chain, the mammalian care system comes into play. And that's where the oxytocin and endorphins are released in the body, right? And we have a sense of well-being. And then further along, and we're there, we're there now. So, it's happening now. In evolutionary terms, the state of consciousness we call mindfulness and presence brings about an integration of the brain, where the brain waves start to interact and coordinate with each other and makes the whole body feel alive. And then also a gentle touch also has the physiology component. I mean, if you just gently put your hand on your wrist here, you can sense that there's a feel of that. There's a gentle touch, and there's a self-compassion aspect to that. And also through the voice. The voice of the critic, right, the internal critic, is very much different than the voice of the compassion itself. So if we look at that, the critic came about with the reptilian brain, and the compassionate voice is coming through presence, mindfulness, self-kindness, and common humanity. So if we continue with the physiology aspect, you can see here the fight, flight, and freeze. The three major inner stresses that come up are the self-criticism, isolation, and rumination. And the antidote for that is mindfulness on the rumination. So in other words, you get lost in your thoughts. I mean, I've heard there was research done that 50% of the average person's lifetime is spent in rumination. So if you live to 90 years old, that basically means 45 years of your life you weren't really there. Isolation, I gave an example before how I experienced that. And the antidote for that is common humanity. And the self-criticism or self-critic voice, the antidote is the compassionate voice of self-kindness. Now I like this Rumi, I'm sorry about that, the Rumi quote. Rumi says, "Our task is not to seek love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that have been built up against it." So built up against it is an interesting way, because built up against it in evolutionary terms, we're going way back to the reptilian brain all the way up to the present time.
But it also sounds like CFT, in that through the empowering questions, we become aware of the barriers, and then are able to work it, deconstruct them in some way.
You have an example, Anne, that you want to maybe share, like that, how that might work?
No, I just think no, don't have something specific, but I think that when we're, for example, working with the shadow, the parts are, if you think that we're brought into the world with this force of good in the world, and then something happens that we then move one way or the other because somebody, a parent, a teacher, whatever, create a barrier, create ways that our life then goes in one way or another, and it creates that there becomes a barrier between the parts. That there are barriers between the part that is dominant and then the quieter part, or the smaller part, and or maybe it's the protector that creates the barriers. And I think through the work, that barrier is, those barriers are lessened.
Right.
And through awareness, the barriers disappear. Yeah. And then we can choose to do whatever we plan to do, but at least there's a choice.
Yes.
The barrier, there's
right.
really a choice.
There's a choice coming through. So through the awareness, you have a choice.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks for sharing that, Anne.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, ready? So now we'll get into the yin and yang of self-compassion. So the yin and yang is really an art of living. A balance between the yin and yang is the art of living. So when we get in a situation when we're more yin, especially when we talk about self-compassion, that's totally moved to yin, then we're kind of, we may be in a cave somewhere, or very much isolated in the sense that we are, not connected with others. On the other hand, if we're totally more to the yang side, we're doing, and we get burnt out and so forth. So we want to bring a yin and a yang component to ourselves, and in that regard to the self-compassion. So there are three components, or three let's call it three aspects of the yin aspect, being with ourselves. The first is comforting. So being to comfort yourself is what may be called as taking a self-compassion break. Now, what can a self-compassion break? Well, there's so many ways, and I'm sure you can give so many examples of things you do in your life, and you're doing it all the time. But perhaps maybe you don't realize that you're actually practicing self-compassion. Now, it could be anything from, when you get emotionally disturbed and you take a walk in the park or in nature, you're taking a self-compassion break. And that's practicing a yin, or being with yourself in a compassionate way. Or you may want to go for a cup of tea. And as you drink the tea, it's making you feel better or calm down or making you relax. So that's a comforting. There's also a soothing touch. And that could be, as I mentioned before, just putting your hands on your wrist and just feeling when you're in a state of irritation or emotional upset. A simple soothing touch really is a compassionate embrace for yourself. And it has a physiological component that works and will filter through. The other yin aspect is what is called validating. So that we practiced in our meditation when we had an emotion come up and we labeled the emotion. So in other words, you're saying, well, this is anger. I feel irritated, or I feel the anxiety. So that's a yin aspect of self-compassion practice. Now, to balance that out, we have the yang aspect, which is acting in the world. Now, the first one is I want to talk about is protecting. Now, with protecting, there's something that we like to call fierce compassion. Now, what does fierce compassion feel like in the body? That's probably the best way to explain it. So if I invite you to take a fist and put it on your chest, and put your other hand right above the fist, right? And now just go like, I'll do it first, and then you can do it. And then as you do it, just sense what it feels like in the body. Stop. Stop.
Stop. Stop.
So we like to think of this aspect of self-compassion is you're able to also, you're steady, you're able to protect yourself. If something is coming, you're able to say no to things. If something is coming into your space that you really don't want to be in your space, you can do it in such a way that you're compassionate as you respond to a situation that is not welcoming to you. You also, and that's a yang aspect. You also could, let's together, just really feel the soles of your feet on the floor with equanimity, right? Feel the body. Also, you kind of shift your shoulders and you're flexible on the top here, right? So you're ready to move. You're flexible. Your feet are firmly on the ground. You're able to move left and right, and you're protecting. So we like to say that when you are in a self-compassion stance, you're able to respond in a very flexible manner. The next item is providing. So providing, which really comes down to fulfilling your emotional needs, as we spoke about earlier. What do I need now is the question. That's a yang aspect. And then motivating. As I mentioned, self-compassion has a motivational component. It's finding your compassionate voice. And we went through that before with the phrases, taking some time to what phrases really resonate with you. And that's a motivational aspect. It's not to eliminate suffering, but it does have this motivational component to relieve suffering. And also, there's also a compassionate letter to yourself. That would be you can write a letter to yourself from the compassionate voice, or write a letter to yourself from the perspective of a very wise and imaginary friend. Okay? So that's the yang aspect of self-compassion, acting in the world to be balanced with the yin, which is being with yourself. Now, the next slide is presence and mindfulness. Now, as I mentioned, the foundation for self-compassion is presence and mindfulness. So there's what I've given here is some portals that have been helpful to people and to myself to enter the state of mindfulness and presence. Of course, one way would be to go directly into that, and that's beautiful. But also, it's sometimes helpful to just say to yourself when something comes up that's bothering you is, what is the problem now? And then become very curious and friendly with the present moment. So in my own experience, I've noticed that when I do that, 99% out of 100, 99 out of 100, there really is no problem right now. So that's helpful, extremely helpful to enter presence. What is the problem right now? The next item, portal, that is helpful is being in touch with your sense perceptions. Just take a moment now and just gaze in the room that you're in and just look around without any labels. So you're in the act of seeing, and just sense or ask yourself, who's doing the seeing right now?
I am.
And the same could be done with hearing. Just take a moment and listen for the sounds that are arising. You're hearing my voice, but are there some other sounds where you are right now? And then there's the inner body as a portal into presence and mindfulness. Now, there's no real adequate definition of mindfulness. It is non-conceptual by nature. But for me, what I like to look at it as sort of a bridge into a state of non-judgmental awareness in the present moment with radical acceptance. And then, even deeper than that, it's a gateway to being. All righty? So now I just want to turn our attention now to compassion, self-compassion, and goals as it relates to our coaching and how we could work with our clients with helping them to recognize when there's self-compassion to themselves and how they could use this in their own lives. So we know right off the bat that goals are a big part of life, right? It determines direction, it increases our motivation, builds self-efficacy, and enhances our focus. Goals also have some pitfalls. Excess focus on goals can have a paradoxical effect. Rather than getting closer to the goal, right, we find ourselves moving away from it. Now, I've experienced that many times. And what I have in front of you now, if you look at it, is a visual representation of what it's like to place your attention in the now, in the present moment, as it relates to goals. So when we're fully in the now, we know what our goals are. You can see down the end, there's that board, right? That dotted board at the end. You know that's the goal. You're fully in the present moment, in the now, where that line is at the bottom, right? Those yellow dots is every step of the way. So you're at the first step, knowing full well where you want to go. So it's very clear, right? Now take a look now on this slide, what it's like to be overly focused in on a goal. The attention is very clear on the goal. You can see the goal at the end, but the lines at the beginning, the yellow lines right in front of you are kind of hazy. So the question comes up when we're with clients, how do we notice when a client comes to us, and let's say it's a presenting agenda, when they're over-focused on a goal? What are the signals that we need to be looking out for? These are some questions I just want, you don't necessarily have to, unless you would like to, of course, respond, but just some questions to consider. A lot of attention on goals means that we spend a great amount of time thinking about that in our head. So there's a lot of fear and worry comes up. Mm. However, some positive thought, neutral and positive thoughts, what is on my to-do list? That's a neutral positive thought. That's a very, very practical way. You're fully present. You know what your goal is. And you've got a to-do list right in front of you. Nothing wrong with that. That's beautiful. Also, if you say to yourself, if I manage to do this task, then I can do that task. You're still fully present in the now, even though you know where you want to go. So that's a positive thought. Even saying, when shall I finish this, is a neutral positive thought. Doesn't create any problems. We need to know, or we need to at least have an idea when we're going to finish a project, right? However, the negative thoughts that get in the way, what if I don't succeed? The question comes when we're with clients, and we notice this sense when they're overly identified with the goal and they're getting this feeling that they're not going to succeed, or if I'm not sure if everything will work out fine, or the idea that I cannot permit myself to fail. So self-compassion, mindfulness come into play here in a big way. How can we be with our clients when we notice these negative thoughts come up in a session? Many goals are set because we believe that achieving them will make us happier. Now let's just take a moment with that idea. Just let it sit with you for a moment. Many goals are set because we believe that achieving them will make us happier. It's very interesting. And again, I think that, these are the kind of questions that when we're with clients, we're going to notice things really where they're coming from. When they say, let's say, for example, client says, I want to move to a bigger house, right? Now, you could think that just by saying that, they think that there may be this underlying sense, they think that moving to the house is going to make them happier. So a lot of this comes down to what we spoke about earlier in self-compassion, the yang component, which is what do I need now? So what does that person really need by moving? Is it really to make them happier, or is it something deeper? So we may say that if it's to make them happier, they're not really in alignment. So the future that never arrives. Well, overestimating the anticipated impact of future events. So the example I gave about moving to a bigger house, right?
Mm-hmm.
Somebody thinks that they're going to, be in a bigger house. Maybe they're going to be able to give more parties and so forth, and whatever the case may be, that's going to make them happier. So we kind of overestimate the future. And we get used to what we achieve. Now, this is a phenomenon that I recently came across. It's called hedonic adaptation. And this is the idea that, when you try something new, and we all know this, we've all experienced this, but it's actually a phrase that over not too long, it even can happen in a meal when you taste a food that's new. By the end of the meal, it's not as tasty as the beginning of the meal. I mean, that's a silly example, but there's an incredible phenomenon in our psyche that has this idea that when we get used to something, well, gradually we start to get less pleased by it, and it becomes like the new normal. So that's in a way like this idea that the future never arrives, and it's short-lived happiness. So what is the coaching opportunity here when we come across clients who, let's say, for example, go in and out of different activities, trying new, it's wonderful to try new things, right? But are they doing it and exploring new things, but are they doing that in the service of their own happiness? Or is there some underlying reason why they're doing it? So the self-compassion here comes into play. Again, going back, think about the three components we spoke about and entering the self-compassion state from any one of those components. Now, integration is really bringing together and your attention for your action, any action in this moment, your undivided attention, and less frustration between the gap now and the goal. So in other words, what we're looking at here is the integration of really bringing your full self to any endeavor you're experiencing in this moment. And there's, as you noticed before, that there's a physiological aspect to that. When the brain waves start to talk to each other, there's an integration of the brain waves, which leads to well-being. And you're also less distracted by negative thoughts. Now we get into letting go of resistance. So this is an item that when I mentioned earlier about when something comes up, some kind of an emotional or reaction, the first thing, the reptilian brain comes in and says, this should not be happening. I mean, what did I do wrong, right? So fear comes up, and it's usually because there was false expectations appearing real. So what is fear? Fear is the thought we are not going to have something we think we need. You can never win from fearful thoughts. So the antidote for this should not be happening is, of course, first of all, recognizing and sensing what you're feeling and being fully aware of it and acknowledging it. And then the loving kindness aspect. These are things that, a soothing voice or a phrase that works for you comes in, which is a beautiful antidote for the critic, which came in originally saying this should not be happening. And then recognizing that there's other people and others that are experiencing things just like you are. However, you have a different flavor of it. So now I just want to talk about what comes up when you start to practice self-compassion for yourself. What will most likely come up is what is called the pain body, or what some call backdraft. Now, backdraft is a term that is used in fighting fires. And that's when there's a fire in a room, right? The firemen go in and they go to the back window and they want to let in fresh air into the window, into the room that's on fire. So what happens initially is that the fire in the room starts to smolder. There's some kind of reaction in the room with the fire. So this is what happens when we start to be self-compassionate to ourselves, because the old pain may arise when we open the door to our heart. The fresh air of compassion comes in, and the old pain and fear is likely to come out. Now, this is to be expected, and this is the beginning of the healing process. So when if we're working on with ourselves in our own practice, or when we're working with clients, we got to realize and expect that this is going to happen, and how we can be there for our clients when they do experience the pain body or backdraft. So continuing along with letting go of resistance, fear is a thought about the future. It has no reality and no truth to it at all. Because I don't think anybody here has ever experienced the future, right? So there is no reality to it and there is no truth. recognize that and turn back to the present moment. And what comes in is more gratitude, paying attention to what is versus looking ahead, satisfaction in the now versus attainment and goal satisfaction, more attention for the way to the goal, easier to see what life has to offer. So as the earlier slide that we saw the picture of the road where it was very clear, as we go along, practicing self-compassion along the way when obstacles come up, right? We know we're very clear when we're present, we're mindful, and we could show kindness and common humanity to ourselves. So as we come to an end, pretty close to the end here, we now, in the beginning, if you remember, we showed you that the three elements of self-compassion where there was a connection to each other. And I talked about that these are three components. Well, the truth is that it's actually one component. Mindful self-compassion is really oneness. And presence, loving kindness, and common humanity are all essentially the same thing. So self-compassion and the coaching process. So here's some ways that I've been able to work with clients with this. First of all, I'm using the gestures that I've illustrated and we've talked about tonight with the open hands, the hands to the heart, and the circle, and helping clients feel that in the body, and also naming the practice when they come up with, when things happen in their lives that illustrate self-compassion aspect to it. I like to name it. I like to name it. You know that you're practicing self-compassion for yourself. And most of the time I'm hearing that people don't realize it. So it's very, very heartening. I'm seeing that people feel that, wow, I didn't realize that I'm being kind to myself. So, but when you realize it and know that you're practicing this, it really only adds to the depth of it. So I'm also making requests, towards the end of the session, requests to clients to do certain practices that we spoke about tonight. Maybe perhaps it could be coming up with phrases that work for them, spending some time alone, experimenting with phrases, building the compassionate voice, taking a compassionate break, and so forth. And then finally, accountability, asking them how they're doing with their practice. So I want to give you one of my major references, and I highly recommend this workbook. It's called the Mindful Self-Compassion Workbook by Kristen Neff and Christopher Germer. It came out this year, and Kristen Neff and Chris Germer have done self-compassion research for many, many years. And most, if not all, of what I talked about tonight is backed by this research. So I invite you to take a look at it. But remember that self-compassion is not something that you really could learn, but you can learn to be compassionate to all your imperfections. And that's how I'd like to end. Thank you so much.
Mhm.
Thank you, George. That was great.
Thank you, George.
Yep. Good job.
So let me go, I'm gonna go back to the main screen. So, you know, I like to spend some time, as I mentioned earlier, if you have the time, it's 20 after 8. If we can go at least another 10 minutes just to go around. Maybe each person take 2 minutes. What's a life for you? If you're in self-compassion with yourself or your clients, and then maybe have just a little bit of feedback, and then we'll go around one time. Just take a moment. Let's give ourselves about 15, 20 seconds, and then we could start.
So I think for me, George, thank you, first of all. Bringing this to the surface and making it a mindful exercise tonight of, I think for me, it's something that it's naturally been ingrained in me over years. And practices, I mean, personally for me, I'm not talking about clients right now, but I'll try to talk about myself, is that the practices that I use, one of them of being self-compassionate, and being aware of staying in the moment one day at a time. And these are all things. And then also being in community, of recognizing that others are also maybe suffering, or that comparing myself to others in a negative way, and then turning that around to really see that we're all working on ourselves, and we're all perfectly imperfect. So to bring this to a more formal setting, as you've done, took me a little while to kind of like, there's a lot there to, think about as far as how to bring this to clients in a more aware, in my own practice, just in a more concrete way, or having it to be more aware in my sessions of self-compassion is very helpful. And to, use it as a tool, another tool. I don't know if it talks about it in the CFT book at all, as far as having self-compassion, but if it doesn't, it should be in there, because I think it's an important aspect, and there is healing properties to it. I mean, the work I do, and the lifestyle I lead, and the people I've been around, the healing aspect of one human connecting with another, and having compassion for each other, is really a mirror for having compassion for ourselves as well. And that is a healing property, because it physiologically, it changes our neural pathways to say, I'm not a piece of crap, I'm actually a good person, and have gratitude for that, or what I bring to others. And that changes how I think, and that also helps to change the way I live in the world. And it kind of is exponential. The more I can do that, the more I can give back on an interpersonal basis, the more that we can help each other, have compassion for each other and for ourselves. So I appreciate the topic. And I was looking actually at the book. There's a couple different ones there. One's a workbook and one's a regular book, but definitely I was about to buy it already. Just because I wanted to be an awareness for my clients that I work with. You know, what I do in EFT is like help to change those neural pathways. But what you're talking about also is doing the same thing in gratitude and in what we do in coaching is helping people change the perception of what they want or who they are in the world. And the piece that stuck out, and then I'll shut up, was the piece about living in now and thinking about the future and being happy in the future. It's like what I like to do is help people to really live in the now and be happy today, regardless of the goals they have. You know, and that to me is the most important aspect of the work I do. So
Thank you so much, Bruce, for sharing that.
yeah, thank you.
Bruce. Yeah.
Well, the thing, it's a lot longer than we have, but one of the things was practicing. I mean, because I was struggling with this whole thing about CFT, the oral and all that, it came to a point that had to do with she had me do the coach's stand, which is my life stand, and then I wasn't feeling the inner flowing water, which, you know, which is around my in my legs, more specifically in my thighs. And so she just had me associate, you know, and what came to mind is that what it all ended up is a 3-year-old in my mother's lap that which is sort of where I became the older sister at that point, and tried to make sense out of the chaos that was our childhood. And so she's having me practice in sitting when those feelings come up, to picture myself being that 3-year-old, and with my holding the hand of my grandchild, actually, and then caring for both of them, you know, this sort of in a way that really and she talks about doing it every, you know, a little bit every day, just like, you know, so that it really becomes mindful, and that you're not doing it just when you're stressed, but you're doing it when you're to sort of start the day, and to really be in, just to really accept the imperfections, and to accept the fact that, you know, you're not perfect. And that's, it was very powerful. And so to have it reinforced tonight is really great.
Thank you, Anne, for sharing.
It's a beautiful image.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, Anne, I'm glad that you brought that up, because that's one of the, I think, really amazing things about parts work, that, and I was very, very resistant to parts work and really hated it. It was, you know, the shadow and all that was my least favorite pathway of all of them, and the most challenging one for me. And that's why I did this course with Guthrie. And the grace that I experience when people find those exiles, typically little parts that have been exiled and that were so vulnerable at one point. And when that happens, the healing that happens for that person and myself and the compassion, self-compassion, that results that I see in my clients in that process is just, it's just, I hate to use the word amazing, but it's just so heartfelt and touching. And, I'm affected in a very deep way in that process. And it's not a technique for everyone. It's not everybody, wants it or finds it effective. But for those who it does work, it's amazing to be in process with someone in that. And, even in my own, practice of self-compassion and, being hard on myself when I've had a challenging coaching session or working with a mentor who I feel is light years ahead of me and I failed that mentor, and, the beating up that I do of myself, and then being taken through that process as well and being able to find that little one of my own that I can, now mindfully as I'm petting my cats, imagine that I'm like that little 4-year-old self-soothing, in the barn, petting my cats, and calming myself down and having myself feel okay. And just, connecting with that part of me. And so I'm just really embarking on this journey of self-compassion. And George, I really appreciate you making this a topic tonight and for covering it in such depth. And I think that for me now, it's just, it's such a beginning piece of the journey. And I think one of the most curious aspects for me is the common humanity part. And that's probably the hardest part for me, because I always just tend to feel like I'm just so alone in my own process or my own stuff, and that I don't feel like anybody else is going through it or would care or it's relevant. So it's always just been this like personal, private journey of my own. So I think that's like one of those things. Yeah. I'm sure the universe will bring it to me when I'm ready to really delve into that. But that's definitely one of those head scratcher things that you've brought to light, and through some of the work we've done together, that it's kind of like, just kind of sit with that. So thank you, George. And thank you guys for sharing too. I'm really glad that we did this tonight and everybody was here.
Yeah, thanks, Patsy.
Yep, have to show up.
Thank you so much to everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So let's just close with a short meditation. Let's go into our bodies. Just notice the stillness. Thank you. Good night.
Thanks, George. Good night, everybody.
Love you guys.
Yep.
You too. Take care.
Take good care.